Great. So, in the 17th, 18th and early 19th centuries, as we've already heard from our previous two speakers, sickness was a common cause of poverty. Sickness, accidents, the associated unemployment, and then the inability to pay medical bills. I'm a historian of the Poor Law, as you've just heard, so I'm mainly going to talk about medical poor relief in England and Scotland. Okay, so in this period there was a patchwork of medical provision for the poor that historians have called the mixed economy of welfare. So this was through the state, in the case of what I study, the Poor Law, charitable relief, informal medical networks, and private medical care through the medical marketplace. So there was very wide-ranging, extensive and expensive medical care that was provided under the Poor Law. It might surprise you that it was so extensive from very early on, particularly in England. Now this might be provided in your own home, mainly in your own home, but also in workhouses, through parishes paying to send people to voluntary hospitals, private madhouses and later asylums. Charitable relief was also provided through things like voluntary hospitals, which come in the 18th century, line-in hospitals for childbirth, charities for women to be delivered in their own homes, fever hospitals, lock hospitals for venereal disease, and, as we know, dispensaries. Informal networks of care through friends, family, employers, or free treatment from medical practitioners was also provided. Lots of medical practitioners did work for free. Mistresses of households were expected to be knowledgeable in medical matters and wrote up medical cures in their recipe books. They're a really good source of, particularly 17th century, domestic medicine. And historians have talked for a long time, and following the reporter who's just been mentioned, on the medical marketplace. So there was access to a wide range of commercial medical practitioners, medicines, products and treatment, widespread medical advertising from the 17th century that even the poor might engage in. So just because they're poor didn't mean they didn't have access to that kind of medicine, to self-cure, to self-dosing. It might even be healing charms or, as we've just seen, patent medicines. Now, while many of these provisions serve different categories of the sick poor, there could also be considerable overlap. Now, the dispensary movement is one aspect of charitable medical relief. And this movement really takes off from around 1770. It's subscription-based, which meant that you had to put a certain amount of money in a year, and then you were given a certain number of tickets as to recommend somebody to either a voluntary hospital or a dispensary. And it was the size of the subscription that enabled how many of these tickets that you got. And it spread very rapidly, as you can see from some of the numbers that we've got up here. Now, there might be specialist ones, such as Leeds Eye Dispensary, Manchester Children's Dispensary, or ones that probably looked at all of the poor, like Daisy has talked to us about this afternoon. And they employed a wide range of medical people. So surgeons and apothecaries, what becomes surgeon apothecaries, the two together, they train in both. Midwives, female midwives, and man midwives as men become midwives in the 18th century. Bone setters, inoculators, and nurses. And as Daisy has shown in her PhD, dispensaries allowed patients to continue in employment and to maintain their family structures, thereby probably providing for a different section of the sick poor than those who had to go into an infirmary or a workhouse where they were taken out of the home or out of employment. However, while dispensaries are undoubtedly important in some towns and cities and counties such as London, Edinburgh, Warwickshire and Wiltshire, they might not be in others, such as Shropshire. So it's really, this patchwork depends on where you're living and what you can get access to. Okay, so I'm a historian of the old poor law. So in England and Scotland, there are bundles of legislation enacted to become, they're called the Old Poor Law because they changed the law in the 1830s and 40s, and that becomes the New Poor Law. In England, this included the appointment of overseers of the poor. So these were the men, they're largely men, who were appointed yearly, who had to collect taxes from local inhabitants and then decided how they were going to give the money out, usually at the parish level. So they would give money to the impotent poor, provide work for the able-bodied, this is in England, and apprentice poor children. It's secular and parish-based. In Scotland, some taxation is also introduced, but there's a far more extensive voluntary provision than there is in England. Relief is provided for the impotent, so it's similar in that way, but certainly within the legislation, they didn't provide work for the able-bodied, so that's a key difference. And levels of assessment on ratepayers tended to be low and topped up by voluntary contributions. And relief is provided through the church and the kirk sessions. It took quite a long time for the Old Poor Law to be implemented in England and in Scotland, probably longer in Scotland. By 1650 in England, a solitary elderly person could probably live off their parish pension. So you didn't have to be old to get a pension, it was just a regular weekly amount. But an elderly person could probably live off this allowance by about 1650. Historians of the poor law in Scotland have shown how levels of poor relief never reached those that they did in England. And the level of taxation was more successful in the lowlands than in the highlands. So even within Scotland, it varies where you are. However, there is some limited evidence of medical relief as early as the late 16th century in Edinburgh and St Andrews and in Glasgow from the 1620s. Thus, it's likely that hospital and dispensary provision was much more important in Scotland than it was in England. In England, there were workhouses, we know from about the 1650s onwards, with a wave of workhouses being set up before, but particularly after, the 1722 Workhouse Test Act. And then there's another act called Gilbert's Act in 1782. So these two acts lead to lots of workhouses being established. We know from a parliamentary paper in 1776 that workhouses and poorhouses were widespread, but their exact use changes frequently, and parishes wax and wane with how they use the workhouse, or if they use it at all. And there are workhouses in Scotland, Edinburgh in some form from the 1720s, with Edinburgh Charity Workhouse in 1743, St Cuthbert's Charity Workhouse in 1758, and Canongate Charity Workhouse in 1761. And these are largely drawn voluntary contributions to run them. And Glasgow from 1731. Okay, so by 1800, English medical poor relief was very extensive. And the poor law was one of the most important sources of medical assistance for the poorest part of society. In England as a whole, Steve King has shown that medical relief rose from about 10 to 15% of all relief in the 1750s to 25 to 30% in the 1820s and 30s. He actually sees the poor law by the early 19th century as a sort of early NHS. It's so extensive. He argues that there was a wider medicalisation of poverty from the 1790s. And most of the money actually went on cash to people in their own home that was medically related in some way during illness, or on medical personnel. And parish doctors come to be surgeon apothecaries, these men that are skilled at both. They might even be men midwives as well. And most of the relief is in people's own homes, what's called outdoor relief, in rural England. So he says the kinds of things that they're attending to. Accidents and injuries, such as fractures, dislocations. There's lots of accidents you can imagine working with horses and carts in 18th century England. Bruises, sprains, ruptures, sore throats, leg and mouth ulcers, boils and abscesses, and sore eyes. They also provide, as we've already mentioned, for childbirth, so under the poor law rather than the charity I just mentioned, and lying in. So they pay for midwives, they pay for surgeons, they pay for men midwives. But 2/5 of medical spending actually went on irregulars. So these are the men that are not surgeons, physicians, or apothecaries. They don't have those kinds of qualifications in the same way, but they're very highly regarded. They provide nursing at home. They provide smallpox inoculations from the late 18th century onwards. They provide pest houses for plague and for epidemics during smallpox. I've just got a paper out on plague in Cambridge in the 1620s and 1630s, and they have a big pest house that they put right in the centre of Cambridge on Jesus Green. I like the idea there are probably bodies under Jesus Green. In an attempt to contain costs, though, because it starts to cost so much, parishes start to negotiate medical contracts with local men. So, for instance, James Lehman, for the village of Campton in Bedfordshire, he was a parish doctor for 29 years. Thomas McGrath was contracted to 7 Bedfordshire parishes and paid by an annual bill on top for another 2. William Elmhurst of South Yorkshire was contracted to 7 parishes, and Bradford Wilmot of Warwickshire to 12 parishes. But then they start to build in exclusions, and they commonly exclude midwifery except for very difficult births. So a midwife has to go, and they're only allowed to call out the doctor if it's going badly. They start to exclude inoculation and vaccination, all smallpox care, accidents and bone setting, amputations, and venereal disease. Now, all of these activities were very time-consuming, and time is money, and they're expensive to look after them as well. So they can make a lot more, so they take the contract, but then they put in an annual bill on top to cover these costs. And that's how the parishes bring in the contract to try and reduce what it costs, and the doctors bring in the exemptions to try and top up what they're earning. Now, medicines and treatments included vomits, purges, blisters, poultices, salves, opium, chamomile flowers, Peruvian jalap, saline powders, antimonial drops, sudorific draughts, anodyne mixtures, pearl barley, balsamic solution, so not on your salad, dressings, compresses, leeches, Godfrey's cordial, Bateman's drops, and paupers were bought crutches, walking frames called rollers, girdles and trusses, wooden legs, splints and leg braces, and of course straitjackets. Okay, the workhouse. Now, workhouses were usually established with deterrence in mind and as a way of cutting costs. However, historians of the workhouse have shown that the poor entering the workhouse quickly medicalised its provision. It actually works. Instead of the able-bodied turning up, the deterrent aspect works, the able-bodied don't turn up. And instead it's the sick, the pregnant, the old and the infirm who are the ones that are coming to the workhouse. And because of this, they hadn't intended to have medical provision, and now they do have to because of those people turning up. So in St Margaret's, Westminster, which was founded in 1725, within a year an infirmary was established, and within 2 years half of its rooms were dedicated to medical functions. 2/5 of applicants were sick or injured. In 1734 in St Margaret's, 200 people were treated for more than 30 conditions. In St Marylebone in the 1770s, there were over 80 conditions that were listed. Before they opened their workhouse, St Martin's in the Fields, which is where the National Gallery is now, that was where the workhouse was, sent their sick poor to a parish nursing home. And this isn't just, say, for the elderly, this is for everyone who's sick. Such as that run by Nurse Pomfret, including unmarried mothers for their deliveries and lying in, with the parish midwife attending, usually Mary Ledouble. Jane Morris, who was aged 29, was passed from Battersea. She was foul with, this is what they call venereal disease, the foul disease. She has VD and she's also pregnant, and she's sent to lie in with Nurse Pomfret. But with the establishment of the workhouse in 1725, they shut all the nursing homes. So thinking about Scotland Edinburgh Charity Workhouse, Edinburgh had three workhouses that I mentioned to you, and we know something about Edinburgh Charity Workhouse. So in 1774, in Edinburgh, most of the poor are actually relieved in the workhouse, 2/3 in the dark blue there. Many more adult women than adult men. This is very common in workhouses. 2/3 of children were in the workhouse, but 1/3 were boarded out in the countryside, and this is very similar to what was happening in London following Hanway's Acts of the 1760s, where the mortality is so horrendous in London that they get them out to nurse, like the London Foundling Hospital in the countryside. So we can see that many more people here are relieved in the house than on pensions in their own homes. And also that the workhouse was used as a house of correction, so an early sort of prison, but a short, sharp shock. You didn't tend to go to the house of correction for very long. And there are 3 houses of correction in London. So let's look inside one workhouse. So in 18th century, St Luke's, Chelsea, it has a wonderful admission and discharge register. We find that 37% of entrants were sick, pregnant, insane, foul with venereal disease, or had fever or ague. Ague is probably malaria. The itch, which is scabies. A further 12% were infirm or lame. And as you can see again in this workhouse, working age women are the ones that are accounting for the largest proportion of those in the workhouse. It was 71% of those who were sick were working age women. So Catherine Savoury and Rebecca Clements, here in the light blue, entered the workhouse pregnant. Catherine and her baby Jonathan both die. Rebecca Clements had her baby 6 days after admission, but her baby Sarah dies at 3 weeks old, and Rebecca got out in the night. She could just ask to leave. She doesn't. She shimmies over the wall. John Custos is the reputed father. He's a jeweller, and there what's called a bastardy examination to ask what the name of the father was. In that, it says that he was a jeweller and that they had had sex at the Angel Inn behind St Clement's Church and at a house known by the sign of the Cheshire Cheese. Hannah Lowry, in light orange, was sick with venereal disease, as was Mary Lowe. So you can see there that it says that they were admitted being foul and sent on to St Thomas's Hospital. So you can see the link there between workhouses and voluntary hospitals and the rural hospitals. Margaret Blunt, in the light pink, she dislocates her shoulder, but she leaves only 4 days later able to work. They presumably popped it back in. Anna Maria Higgs, in light green, she's suffering from the itch, which is scabies, which is highly infectious. Eleanor Lynn and Mary Mason, in darker orange, were both described as lunatics. Eleanor dies, but Mary leaves the house recovered. Others went on to Bethlehem Hospital. And Christopher Grimstead, you can see here that he's in twice in dark blue, and he's sent on again to another of the hospitals, to St George's Hospital. And although he was age 70, he went back into service. He goes back to work, age 70. Of those who were sick, about a quarter of them die in the workhouse. And the workhouse was frequently used as a community morgue, and bodies might be subjected to post-mortem or even illegal dissection. Now, this might look like a high death rate, if you're a quarter of them dying, but it's largely caused by the characteristics of the inmates. They're very seriously ill when they come in, or elderly. It's not necessarily that the workhouse is what's killing them. And voluntary hospitals might exclude conditions, which is why people end up in the workhouse. It might exclude the itch, smallpox, scald head, leprosy, venereal disease. Men were far more likely to get one of these precious tickets for admission to the Lock Hospital for venereal disease, where they get better treatment than the women who don't manage to get a ticket end up having in the workhouse. And that might also be true for the itch as well. And there are many more workhouses than hospitals in London, so that might be where you end up. Okay, so as we have seen, sickness was a very common cause of poverty. This would have been true of England and Scotland alike. England, however, had a more extensive old poor law, both in generosity of poor relief given out in cash and kind at home, as well as in the workhouse, and the provision of medical care, which is very substantial by the end of the old poor law period. There was far more medical relief on offer outside the poor law, as well though through charities, informal networks and the medical marketplace. London in particular was extremely well provisioned, but other provincial cities would have some of this patchwork of relief as well. Nevertheless, since we're here to celebrate Edinburgh, Edinburgh comes to provide extensive medical relief by the late 18th century, but primarily outside of the poor law, through its infirmary and through its dispensary.